everybody. Kendall here with Corran on the Horn. I am with Mr. Geoff Bowman. So Geoff, how'd you get started with Star Wars cards?
Great. Great question there. Happy to be here and chat with you today. I originally bought Premier Packs with my younger brother back in 1995, and I actually still have the two cards I pulled from our first two packs. It was Lone Warrior and Rebel Planners. And yeah, just took off from there from Premier, played with friends at school. I was 10 when the game came out, and the rest is history.
Mm-hmm. So, as you remember, Lone Warriors and Rebel Planners, I have tried to figure out what my first rare was. Like thinking back, I know that I know that I had a Dagobah. It was a Dagobah pack, and I'm pretty sure it was a Dark Side Red card was my rare, but I haven't been. I've sort of like headcanoned once or twice what I think it might have been, but um yeah, it was definitely not of anything of anything memorable. And I feel like so many people, they're like, oh yeah, I opened my first pack and it was a Millennium Falcon, and so then and so
Of
I for
course,
a
you can remember
while,
that. Yeah.
yeah, well, for a while I figured those are the people that stuck around, are the people whose first pack was something really good, the people who who got Cantina Brawl as their first rare or something like that. Maybe they didn't stick around quite as long. Um, so you have a you I mean, the reason that you got on my radar was that Joe Olson said that you played in Las Vegas, and you went and however many in the main event, and then you took down the retro event. So I'm assuming that means that you're a retro player primarily.
Definitely, yeah. So, like I mentioned earlier, started the game, with Premiere when it came out. I grew up in San Diego, so played with a lot of the San Diego crew from probably like a little before Endor onwards. I didn't really discover the tournament scene until I was probably, I don't know, 13, 14, something like that. Still had to have my mom drive me around, all that good stuff for a couple of years. But yeah, I got real heavily into the game for quite a few years. Also played Star Trek CCG first edition when that was popular and still in print. And then moved to Vegas in 2009. So I ended up playing with Chris Schoenthal, Kevin Shannon, some of those guys once they moved to San Diego towards kind of the latter half of that period. And then once I moved to Vegas, I just didn't keep up. There really wasn't anyone here. I know Jeff Levine is here. I'd actually met him at the Vegas DPC Deck Tech Players Challenge way back in the day, and we'd kind of fallen out of contact, and yeah, just couldn't really find anyone to play. So like many, I took a break from the game. I dust my cards off here and there and go to sell them, and then get to a point where I didn't want to, and kind of go through that cycle over and over. So yeah, ended up having the big Vegas Grand Prix here with Chris, and Anthony Batmouse was, I don't think he did a ton of planning this time around, but he was instrumental in planning the event we had 2 years ago. And yeah, thought I'd give it a try at Open. I knew the event was coming for a couple months, so I quickly got up to speed. And yeah, it was a story of just getting destroyed game after game. So I went, it was brutal, man, to be honest. So I went 1-3 on Friday night in the preliminary event. My lone win coming from a bye. My first game, I was paired up against Logan. Luckily, he wasn't on asteroids, but he was on light side. But I still got absolutely hammered in that game. Went 0-8 on Saturday, and I probably was at about 25 total open games at that point by the end of Saturday, and yeah, it was just a total slog.
Yeah, yeah. I've been. I mean, we've all had those events. Um. So, and I mean, I've also been on the other side where I do, I mean, I'm not going to win a major, but where I do respectably at a 3-5 or a 4-4 or something, and then just
Yeah.
get demolished in a retro event. Um, I've at least the last couple that I've played in, I was smart enough to net deck. Uh, in a few years ago, I was like, oh well, I've played a little bit of these these decks in various formats. I can just, and then you just forget that the rules are totally different. It's just
Yeah.
what you're trying to do is totally different. Um, so I see that you were on for the main event, at least you were on Hitco and Agents of the Black Sun. What made you pick those decks?
It's a good question. So originally, I really tried to get into Open probably like the first quarter of last year, around like February, March, after the previous Vegas event, and I started playing with QMC, and I started playing Bring 'Em Before Me. Well, Bring 'Em Before Me plays completely differently than it does in Decipher only formats.
Mm,
So I kept getting just absolutely wiped out with that. So I put that aside. QMC, I got up to speed with, but as I found out when I kind of picked things up back in September, October timeframe, it just QMC is such a reactive deck that you really need to understand what's coming, what's potentially coming, whether it's next turn, 2 or 3, 4 turns out, whatever it may be. So I found myself in a place where I actually felt like I got set up pretty decently, but then I had no idea how to really mitigate anything mid game and
mm,
beyond. So I
mm.
just got crushed online. And then I also had picked up the Agents of the Black Sun deck, or excuse me, I'm brain farting on it. Oh my gosh, what is it? The Alien deck, My
Hitco,
Kind of Scum.
my kind of scum.
My Kind of Scum. The other 4-letter acronym one. So I played that quite a bit in the Reflections 2 formats, things like that, in Retro. And so yeah, the Thok and Thug version was really popular the last couple months, and then the errata hit. So I peeled away from that, peeled away from QMC, just thinking that I wouldn't perform particularly well with it. So ended up doing Agents of the Black Sun. That seemed like kind of a safe play. Seems like kind of a tier 2 deck, but again, I've played that quite a bit and I'm pretty comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then went with Hitco because it seemed like one of those decks where even if I didn't have the ability to anticipate what would be coming, it's just such a brute force deck. You get Luke out, he's a tank. You can just go after people with the rest of your characters and
Mm-hmm.
just battle away and hope for the best. So I felt like I would at least have a 50-50 chance. Ended up being more on the 0% side in terms of results. But yeah, overall, it was fun to play both the decks, but it's just such a challenging dynamic to understand the mechanics of the game, but generally not have an idea of what the other player is going to be doing beyond very basic level stuff.
Right. Well, and I mean, sorry, the cat got in the way.
Oh,
Um, I wouldn't mind her except for she was starting to get mess with the keyboard.
no, keyboard cat there for you.
But yeah, she had to be locked in my room for most of the day because we had maintenance in. So she's probably a little more needy than usual. Um, so yeah, it's interesting you describe QMC as a reactive deck and Hitco as a brute force, because I feel like Hitco, can be Hitco is, I mean, it's definitely got a plan A,
Right.
but it definitely is a deck that you need to know whether you're going to be the guy that is. It's who's the beatdown. It's you need to know whether you're the guy who is, that is brute forcing and going for all the battles or whatever, or whether you're the one that should be trying to set up for, a steady drain of 2 or 3 all game, and then
Right.
more. So that's interesting. And then QMC, I don't think of that as a reactive deck at all, but I also
Interesting.
don't know how to play it. But I mean, its setup is pretty scripted. You do it kind of the same every game, and then I mean, I guess you have the toolbox, so you have the ability to be reactive, and literally you're reacting like you're running away from
That's yeah.
fights. um but I don't. and yeah, I guess there's the tool. There is like the toolbox element of there's a high skill ceiling, and it's not like you're playing the same every game. But I don't really think of it
Yeah, it's just
as reactive as some other decks.
interesting. And that could just be contextually, right? You have a better understanding of the current open
Or
game
you
versus
have a
me who's
better
a new.
understanding of the deck because it's not a deck that I know.
So, and that is interesting because the context in which I've always tried to get it to work, at least in the retro formats, where it's always been a tier 2 or even below deck, right? Is you get to your point, you get set up the same. You need to occupy enough spots to be able to flip to get the tunnel vision going, every turn tunnel vision going, and then it's really this game of like dancing around, setting up your drains, engaging in battles that are fortuitous for you, that sort of thing. So maybe it's just a different definition of
Right.
reactive in that sense. Because to your point, it is literally reactive. You're reacting to what the opponent's doing when you're pathing away and run loop running and all that stuff.
I tend to think of decks that are platform decks, meaning that you've got your system and your related sites, and you're trying to kind of hold that however you can. I kind of think of those as being more the proactive decks, and then decks where you're tending to where you're deciding whether or not to invade your opponent. I think of those as a little bit more reactive, but also like that is a thing about Star Wars cards is we all have none of us use the same definitions for our terminology. I mean, because there's not enough of us, and none of us know what we're talking about. So at best,
very
we're like,
true, very true.
It's like a control deck. I mean, I guess that's what QMC is, a control deck, arguably. In the sense
That's
that
true. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah,
you're often denying your opponent the opportunity to battle. You've got that site where you're canceling their force drains and
right.
and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely a control deck, but it's not a manipulator deck, right? Because to your point, like, and maybe it's a split deck, right? Because the first portion of the game, whether you want to call it the setup phase, that's very scripted, like you said. You need to do a prescribed amount of things in order to flip and get to a point where you can start drawing on the advantages of the actual platform. And then it becomes more reactive because you want to maintain control of the system. You want to maintain control of a couple of locations, get that, that site that has the drain modifier, all that stuff in play. Yeah, so that is a very, very valid point. We all have definitions of what makes a deck a reactive deck versus a platform deck versus a manipulator, all those different.
Yeah, because a lot of this vocabulary comes from Magic the Gathering, where it's like really straightforward. Like a control deck, you're denying what your opponent can do. A mid range deck, you've got a certain curve. The aggro decks, you're like, there's not really an equivalent to an aggro deck in Star Wars cards. It's I don't know, and there's also like QMC has a factor of like it's got like board complexity. So that's where that to me is where it's scared me away from it, because you're half your deck is on the table doing a million different things. And so because you have so many decisions, there's a high skill ceiling to it. And maybe that's where it's reactive, because you're going to change, those decisions are going to be based on the board state and everything else.
Yeah, and every unit in your deck, for each life force becomes more and more valuable the more you have out on the board, because your tools to win are limited. So no, that's a really good take on it.
It is interesting. I also think QMC is interesting because it's got that that force pile pull every turn, but the way that the deck is built and the way that cards are in Star Wars cards, like, it's not like you're sometimes you are finding your like one answer, your toolbox, but the deck isn't really a toolbox. The deck is good aliens and good cards. It's just everything's good cards, right?
Yeah, it's almost like a Cheesecake Factory menu type situation when you go into that force pile, especially like mid game when there's so many different avenues and so many different ways to move the game forward, that it makes it almost crippling in a sense, because you have decision apathy. Like, there are all these options and they're all so good, I don't know which one I want.
Enough talk about your failings. I'm not, that's not, no need to dwell on that. So I mean, are you, so I think you're active on GEMP. Are you are you the best retro player out there? Like what is, you
Definitely,
know,
definitely not. Definitely not. No, I think there's a really good group of retro players. The retro series run by Steve Sanders, who's done an
Mhm.
amazing job this last 3 or 4 years, of which I've been a part of it. This is my third year in it. Some really, really good players. Paul Todd Feldman has just been the undisputed champion. He was really good, back when the game was in print with Decipher. I actually went and looked for my old tournament report on the Deck Tech Players Challenge here in Vegas, and came across it. And sure enough, Paul was, I think, fourth or fifth place in that tournament that had 120 people or something like that. And Johnny Chu, I think, was in first place. But yeah, real good players. Joe Horby's really good. His handle is How Do We Get in This Mess, but abbreviated. Paul's handle is Dr. Torch. Um, Brad Kippel is also pretty good. I think other guys. Dylan over from Germany, he's really good. But yeah, I've done fairly well. I ended up taking second place in the indoor segment of the retro series. For folks that aren't familiar with it, there's five individual tournaments in the year, and it progresses from Premier to Hoth all the way up to the last one we did was Premier through Reflections 2 last year. And I ended up getting second in the Premier to Endor format tournament. I went 6-0, Paul went 6-0, and Timo went 6-0 in the tournament. So we ended up having a kind of an awkward three-way tiebreaker. So Paul was technically first, so I ended up playing Timo, beat him, and then lost to Paul. I was so just caught up in preparing for Timo's game that I didn't really prep to play Paul, and just kind of went into that game a little bit kind of under the radar there. But yeah, I definitely would not, to answer your question, I would not rate myself as one of the best. I'd say I'm decent. I'm broadly happy with a 4-2 performance across a six
Mhm.
game series. There's always room to improve. Um, yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think most people are probably pretty happy with a 4-2 performance, regardless of the event. Most people, there's probably some people that let it. I mean, I guess it depends on what those two were like, but
Right.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, so do you so with the retro, retro versus open, um, do you feel like you put more energy into playing retro, like actively playing retro, and then you just haven't had an interest in open, or is it more that you're, you know, relying on skills that you learned 20 years ago, or
That's a
what
good
is it that
question.
makes you focus on retro?
It's a mix of both. So obviously, I can do well in a retro format. I mean, we can talk about it in a second. But I mean, I went 4-0 the day after I went 0-8. So clearly,
Mm-hmm.
the skill set is there somewhere. The ability is buried
Right,
beneath
right,
it.
right.
Yeah, I think the challenging bit with the open game is that it seems so familiar, yet it's so foreign to me, where I haven't kept up. Originally when the first, couple of virtual cards were in print, or in virtual print, whatever you want to describe it as,
Yeah.
I kept up with it, right? I felt like I was decent. I would play Kevin and Chris and some of these other guys. Um, I hung, I was able to hang with these guys. Um, and then I walked away from it, and I've tried to jump in at various points, and the barrier to entry, it's just, there's so many cards. I think I went and looked, and there was something like 1,100 virtual cards, and it's such a massive catalog. And the other piece that's daunting is there is just such a wide range of decks that are viable, and the meta
Mm-hmm.
is ever changing with the new releases. So it's just it's a challenging game to get back into because I've missed so much of it. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's an impossible thing, but to answer your question, I definitely have put more energy into retro, but kind of to your point, there's a lot to draw off of there. So the nice thing about playing these retro formats is I remember what was good back in Premiere to Hoth days. I remember what was good in, Premiere to Special Edition, all these eras. So kind of your point, when you were making, decks off the cuff without net decking, you broadly remember what was good. So it's just a lot quicker to get up to speed. And the interesting thing, even in a format where the card pool is completely fixed, there is an ebb and flow of meta, which is just bizarre. So if you go back and look at some of these early retro tournaments, from Steve's series, and you go look at the the replays from 3 or 4 years ago, the decks that were being played in the top eight, top matchups, they're different than what they were now or what they are now. So it is interesting to see that. I think if I put the same amount of energy into open that I've put into retro and then some to catch up, I could get there. It's just going to take time and bandwidth. And I've got 3 kids. I work full time. There's just only so many hours in the day. So for me, I think like a lot of other retro players, it scratches that Star Wars itch, and you don't have to put a ton of time into it to at least be decent and not get destroyed every week.
That's so interesting. Because I feel kind of the opposite. I mean, I've always, I haven't kept up. I've kept up for the last 6 years since I've been back, but I was in and out for those 19 years before that. And
Right.
And so for me, first of all, I feel like retro formats have a bunch of cards. Like when people, especially the worst thing that a new player can do, in my opinion, especially if they want to have the optimal Star Wars card experience, which to me the best version of the game is the current version. The worst thing you could do is say, I'm going to start with Premiere, and then I'm going to play Premiere and A New Hope, and then I'm going to play Premiere, A New Hope, Hoth, and then I'm going to run out of steam. Like that's the, if you really insist on playing those, the Decipher card formats, play Premiere to Death Star 2. Start with the Death Star 2 starter decks because they're fun to play. Play Premiere to Death Star 2, play Premiere to Reflections 2, or just dive right into the open meta, honestly, because there are however many. I'm not going to fact check you on the number of virtual cards because I have no idea, but there are a lot of virtual cards.
Yeah.
But approximately, I think somebody did, and this is where nobody should fact check me either. We live in a world without fact checking, according to Mark Zuckerberg. So,
Perfect.
but so no fact checking. But I think it was Andy Talaga or somebody did an analysis of all the open decks of all the cards that have seen play in open decks at majors in the last 6 months or something like that, and it's like 400 cards or something like that. Like it's a much smaller card pool of playable cards. When I see a new set come out, I look at it and I'm like, okay, of the decks that I know how to play, there's 6 cards here out of 50 that I'm going to have to learn. And then there's probably another dozen cards that other people are going to play, and it's a good amount. That's not a criticism of design or anything. I think it makes perfect sense to design a bunch of cards. But for me, I think just going into the deep end with open, especially if open is eventually your goal, is the choice to do it. But then trying to go back into retro stuff is interesting. I played in a Premiere to Death Star 2 event, and I liked that format a lot. Premiere to Reflections 2, I wish that that Watch Your Step wasn't as dominant.
So we've actually had lots to unpack there. That definitely sounds like an Andy project to put together those stats. So you may not be wrong there. If he didn't actually put together that project, I'm sure that he had it on his short list of things to do when he had time for it. But I agree. I don't particularly like the early formats. Like we're playing Premiere to Hoth right now, and light side is just so disadvantaged to the point where I'm 2-0, 2 weeks into it, and I won my light side game. So I feel like I'm almost a lock to be 4-2 unless I have some sort of a bad draw in a dark side game, because it's just so luck dependent. Like you have to draw your locations, then you've got to draw all of your other key cards. It just feels like you're almost better off flipping a coin than actually playing the game. But there are some people that really like that era, just because they're purists. They like the original Darth Vader against Farm Boy Luke and the premier Obi-Wan, and that's just the game that they really enjoy. I definitely enjoy the Premier Death Star 2, Premier Reflections era. The version that we've played, I think the last 2 years, actually had Watch Your Step and Agents of the Black Sun banned. So that's led to some really interesting meta choices. Hidden Base ends up being pretty good. Throne Room is pretty good. Hunt Down's really good. Bringham's really good. And there's some other decks in there as well I'm not mentioning. But yeah, that for me, that's the best game in terms of just pure ability to play combined with entertainment value, all that. And I would agree, as a new player, jumping into Premier to Hoth is just going to be a nightmare.
Yeah. I don't know. I just it's and then the other thing is the other problem with Premier to Reflections 2 is that I really like Watch Your Step. So
right, so you don't want to play against it, but you want to play with it, so it creates this odd dynamic.
Yeah, well, and I don't mind playing against it. I don't want it to like we did a few years ago, and this is I'm the guy that did the one, that did this one time and pretending like an expert. But a few years ago, the Corellia League did a Premier to Reflections 2 event, and
everyone played Watch Your Step
for the entire event, Watch Your Step won every game except for one.
Jeez.
That's not me. That's literally, yeah. So all the light side players played nothing but Watch Your Step. I think there was one ISB deck that was like built specifically to beat Watch Your Step
to counter it, and it had it just squeezed through a couple of
but the rest of the wins were all Watch Your Step. But it's like especially like the Palace Raiders version of Watch Your Step is what like one that I love. So that like early, I guess that technically that version usually would use episode 1 cards because it would use all 3 docking bays. But like I love that. That's one of my all-time favorite decks, but it doesn't have a format where it's balanced.
Yeah, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
And that's the issue with some of these like Decipher era decks is back in when the game was in print, there wasn't this polarity where people had figured out this is the true tier 1 deck and everyone's on it. Just like right now in the Premier to the Hoth League, it's just Scanning Crew decks are super popular right now, and people are moaning and bitching about it. And there's a version out there right now that plays 15 Scanning Crews. I don't think anyone was playing that back in 1996 or 1997, whenever Hoth came out. And it's just this, this added benefit of, yes, we had Deck Tech, yes, we had the Force.net and some other resources, but being able to watch others play live is something that you weren't really able to do, because even at tournaments, it was a bit of a gray area to, really watch somebody else play their game.
Right. But, yeah, I don't know. I don't know when Deck Tech became a thing, because that, you're talking about, if you're talking about 95, 96, like
I don't think Deck Tech was a thing. That was like Scry. I was looking at like Deck Lists and Scry magazine and Inquest. There, Decipher had their message boards, and I think there was a page where they posted decks and stuff, but nothing like what we have now, obviously.
I haven't. Yeah, because most of when I think of the Decipher website, I think of, and this is probably because of my age and where I was and stuff, like I think of in 2002, going back to the Decipher website and just like digging down, clicking all the links and reading deck lists from, but even then it was, you're talking about 99 2000, like you're the last few sets. You're not so much talking about you're not so much talking about Premier through Hoth. Yeah, the first video I ever watched on the internet was the 2000 World Championship finals.
Nice, nice, very nice.
Yeah, so
You don't remember your first cards you pulled, but you remember your first video you watched on
my
the internet.
first
So
internet
there's something
video.
for
Yeah.
you.
I also remember that when my family first got the internet, I wanted to go to decipher.com to look at cards.
Look at
You
the
know, they have the
cards.
card
Yes,
lists and
yes.
and my mom told me, I don't know, our computer's not really good with pictures. So yeah, that
Sit there and
was
wait 5 minutes for like a Cantina Brawl
yep,
or Cantina Brawl.
exactly. You know, or a Darth Vader or a Son of Skywalker. Yeah, definitely.
Good
And
times. Good
then like
times.
print them, I'd like print them out and they'd be like
They're the wrong
oversized.
size. They're
Yeah.
too big. You can't use them as a proxy. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I don't even know if the concept of proxies like had occurred to me. I just remember them being like the card takes up like the whole page, using up all my parents' ink.
Oh man, those were the days.
So I do a segment called and appropriately he recommended you for the podcast, so this is a very important segment. I call it how to make Joe Olson better at Star Wars cards.
Perfect. All
And
aboard.
where I do try to ask my guest something about advice for like getting better at playing the game. So I have two questions for you. First, what advice do you have for the open player who doesn't have a background in these retro formats if they wanted to play in a Premiere to Death Star 2 side event or something like that?
I would say broadly, it's the advice I give to myself for open. Just try it. It's fun. It's still the game you love. You're probably gonna get destroyed. More games that you can count on your hands and your feet. Um, and just get reps. I mean, just like with open, it's the same thing. You just need to understand how the game works. The mechanics are going to be there, but it's the speed, right? It's just such a different pace. With open, it's almost like I would almost relate it to some of the newer Star Wars movies where you just drop out of hyperspace and you're in it versus having this build up. Like you
Okay.
talk about Premiere to Hoth, there's this inordinate amount of time where you're just drawing for a couple of turns, and maybe you deploy a location if you draw into one. So it's just such a different speed where you don't just accelerate right into the game like you do with open. And that was a really interesting perspective to have after playing open for basically 2 days straight, playing call it a dozen games between, it's actually more than that because I played 8 games plus the 3, and I played a couple of pickup games as well. To come to it from the other side, I felt like I was forgetting so many things because there's just so many fewer. This comes from the Star Trek days, but so many fewer download chains where you're just like grabbing this to grab this to grab this other piece. So my advice would be just watch some of the streams, go try it out for yourself. It's not as daunting as it may seem. And it's funny because a lot of people will comment on just the cheesiness of the game, right? You've got cards like numbers, anger for aggression, all these things. I don't particularly like when people play those against me, but I think the interesting part about that dynamic is it's setting those types of cards up, right? There's just different ways to deal damage, just like there is in the open game, right? So yeah, my advice really would be just watch some of the top players play to see how the high level game is played, and then just try it yourself. Net deck away. Definitely wouldn't go and just try and. You could actually just try and build your own decks and just see what happens. But really, to be successful, you've got to net deck it. You've got to watch games. There's going to be a layer, just like with open, where you see top players playing, and it's just you're going to go and try and do it, and it's just not going to resonate because you don't see all of their different windows that they're trying to operate in. You don't see what they're doing on turn 2 that'll affect something in turn 10. So yeah, just like it with anything, just get reps. And don't be afraid. It's a fun game.
Yeah, that's true. And I agree. I agree. The cheese level is interesting because I feel like that's where I liked the Premiere to Death Star 2 experience that I had, because it's like there's definitely cheese going on, but you have some tools to mitigate it, and
Right.
you still are ultimately trying to control sites and win battles, which I think the game, and I think this is where it's always been a little easier for me to jump into open, is because fundamentally in open play, your goal is to win battles and control sites, and the other avenues to winning either require you to win battles or control sites, or are like sort of supplementary
Right.
like incremental damage, whereas sometimes in those retro events it's just like somebody pulls out some card you've never seen before, and it's like, like I mean, I guess Harvest still sees some play, but like, if they're looping Harvest every turn and you don't have any way to mitigate their retrieval, so they're
No
just doing,
grabber, no secret plans. It just cycles, and it's just this like never-ending death
yeah,
spiral that you
and
can't
they
get
get
out
to
of.
pick which 4 cards they want. Like, that's ridiculous. And you just are like, if you're not prepared for it, then you're like, I mean, and then also they've dedicated their whole deck to being able to achieve Harvest, so they're not winning the game either.
It just
they're
goes
force
on.
training you for 1, and then they're retrieving their whole lost pile.
Yeah, it's just like net gain of like 3 cards
Yeah,
effectively, turn over
yeah,
turn, and it never kind of fizzles out.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But like the advice I would give to people that are, that do remember the game, that have these kind of triggering memories of Harvest being played on them, 32 times across a 12 turn game, even though it's a unique card, but I exaggerate there a little bit, is there's counters for that stuff in Death Star too.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's nothing in the game that is coded in GEMP, coded in GEMP. Frozen assets is an exception there, that will completely just destroy your deck. Like there are ways to overcome it. Like in this past series for Death Star 2, in the top 8 championship this last year, I think 3 or 4, maybe 5 players were playing basically a version of Throne Remains with Anger, Fear, Aggression. Well, you know what? There are counter cards to it, right? Projective Telepathy straight up cancels it. Yes, it's an interrupt. Yes, it can be sensed, I believe. Yes, you can grab it, but you can also play a card like Resistance, which sees a lot of play in open right now, where you can just occupy a bunch of sites. Well, great. I'm going to sit here and ping you at a couple sites, and Anger Fear is going to hit me for 2 force. So move on. So there are ways to beat it. The space that's really frustrating was Premiere to Endor, and this is why I actually really enjoy these older formats to a degree, because we're able to do stuff, at least I am, that I wasn't able to do or accomplish as a 13 or 14, 15-year-old, whatever it was, either due to lack of knowledge or lack of physically having the cards. This last series for Endor, like I was about to say, Route to Your Ops was played by probably, not to the degree of your Watch Your Step experience in your league, but probably, if I had to guess, 50% of the decks, and a lot of folks that were higher end players were playing it. So I ended up playing a deck in the final against Timo that I was on light side, he was on Route to Your Ops, and the whole design of my deck that I played was to just resource starve him. So it was a Throne Room mains deck, and I think it started Throne Room. It was Throne Room, and it played, I think, 7 or 8 nudges.
Nudges,
So I
yeah.
just came down and immediately just occupied all his sites. That was an area where you didn't have prepared defenses, so you could start a rest order, which was probably the start for him. There's no mobilization points to boost your activation, so really you're just hoping to draw into sites, and by the time you play sites with your objective, nudge comes down. So it got to a point where he was activating maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 a turn, and I'm activating 15, and I locked him down. So like those sorts of meta calls can occur, but I digress.
Yeah, that's what you're here for. Yeah. I mean, the meta thing is really interesting, because that's where you having that experience and that that understanding. And I mean, I guess if you're playing in that style of tournament where you are probably aware of what of what other people have been playing, and you can adjust throughout the event, that gives you the opportunity to to build a deck that is specific to a certain thing. And yeah, that nudge deck, I think I played a version of that in Premier to Death Star 2. I forget. I played a throne room deck in a Premier to Death Star 2 event that I forget if it had nudges or not, but I've definitely seen various versions of that deck.
Yeah, usually it'll run 2 just so you can cancel the activation for your sites on Yavin, but to go and kind of take over their sites is a little bit of a different play on it.
Yeah. Is there anything, I mean, I know that you're not totally comfortable with open, but are there
Definitely
any
not.
are there any skills that you've learned from playing in these retro formats that you think could transition to open, and vice versa? Your experience playing the dozen or so open games, did you learn anything that you feel like you'll be able to apply to the retro formats in the future?
That's a really good question. So I would say my approach to the game has definitely changed in the last probably 2 years. So like the first year I was back was just knock off the rust, just play, have fun, be happy with a 3-3 or a 2-4, or even a 1-5, to be completely honest. I'd say that I just look at how the game is designed to win a little bit differently. Kind of to your point, I think a lot of people look at it purely as I need to occupy sites to either win with big drains or I need to go in battle and win battles. I think with the retro game, there's definitely a higher element of non-direct damage that's dealt through other cards, whether it's like numbers, anger, fear, inserts, which again I hate being on the receiving end of. There's no denying that. But it's just leveraging your resources differently. Like I would have never thought, and to be completely transparent here, the deck that I played against Timo was not my idea. Somebody else suggested it to me at a point during that tournament, like, oh, this is actually pretty cool. Like I might try this. Maybe you should try it. There's a little bit of a more secretive element in the retro crowd, which kind of makes it fun, but also a little bit odd at the same time. Because I don't think people really know who other people play with. So there's kind of this cat and mouse of knowledge versus I think people in the open side are a lot more open with it. Excuse the repetition of words there.
Depends on the event. I think there's
Yes.
there's definitely some, it depends on the deck and the event. There's definitely some closed doors that exist in the in the open community as well.
Yeah, maybe not as much as the eye might see at first glance, but yeah. So I've started to look at the game differently. Like I look at it more as resource control because that's really what it is. And to your point earlier about like having a bunch of cards on the table, I was watching a Premier Hoff game the other night, and this guy was on dark side. I'm like, you're gonna win this game, but he just kept deploying cards. And I sat here and kept, there's 31 cards on the table. Like that's too many for that format. Like you're not in a state where you're gonna have half a dozen or 10 effects out and shields, etc., of which there are no shields. But it just it's a different approach. And something that I've learned to do as well, and going back to your harvest example, is I always looked at the lost pile as lost. That's not lost. It's temporarily unavailable. Like you just can't get to it right now. But leveraging it, and there's a deck that I've toyed with the last couple of years, and it's a profit deck, and it's non-interactive, and it has several stages to ramping up, and then boom, it just drops at the very end. Drops a Kessel Drain, drops a Cantina Drain, and by that point, the dark side players kind of exhausted themselves. But then at that point, I can go back and like tap into my lost pile when I flip and get Han out. I can go and use other cards, whether it's an edge, whether it's something else, to go and grab cards I need out of there, effective repairs to go grab an effect I need. So I think that's the big piece that I've learned, and that is definitely something that exists more in open, is just that accessibility to lost pile. Like there's different tools to retrieve, like Walkling you can dump end of game or anytime you want, as an example. So that's a piece that I feel is really useful in both formats. And I think as I get more comfortable with open, it'll probably improve my skill in retro. The tools are different, right? The actual cards are different, but the mechanism and kind of the different scenarios will inform decision making in the other format, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. You talk about the lost pile as a resource. I remember one of my sort of like aha moments as a player. I'm very well known for playing a lot of Court of the Vile Gangster, and
Good to know.
I
Running
remember the
against the
game.
sequence.
I remembered the game where I realized that I had no escape in hand, and I realized that like I was kind of having trouble finding what I needed, and I got force trained, and it was like, well, this no escape isn't doing anything. Who cares about the top card of my lost pile. And then I realized, oh, but if I peel my from my reserve deck, I might lose a good card, and this is probably the last time that I'm going to lose force before my deploy phase. So
Right.
I can lose a good card, and if I lose a good card, then I can no escape it, or I can or I have Jabba's Haven virtual lets me retrieve an alien into hand. Maybe I'll peel an alien.
Yeah, there's
There's other there are reasons to fill up your lost pile a little bit. And yeah, that's always, it's all about resources, because you described the guy that put 31 cards on table, and it's like he just kept deploying cards, and he's running, but there's the other side of it where as long as you get your opponent to zero life force, it doesn't matter if you have 30 cards or 2 cards. So sometimes there are, because I can't tell you how many times I've had like those like kind of like mid to late game, not quite fully late game, where I've basically gotten to where we're both of us have like 15 life force left or something like that, like enough that you could do something, but you're probably not
you're a
going to
little
do a
restricted.
ton.
Yeah, exactly.
And we're both doing 2 to 4 damage a turn or something like that, so we both kind of have each other on a clock, and I'll be like locked into that clock to where I'm like, okay, if nothing happens for the rest of the game, then I win. And then my opponent deploys 3 cards, and I'm like, yes, he deployed 3 cards. That puts me way ahead in the clock. And
That's
then he
another
battles
turn,
me.
exactly.
And then he battles me and hits me with a lightsaber and overflows me for the rest of my cards. Or even worse, like he deploys 3 cards, and he's able to do like 1 more damage per turn. So it's like it doesn't seem like it's worth it, but then you do the math.
The
And
calculus makes it worth it.
yeah, and it does that, and then he deploys another card the next turn to where now he's out damaging me by 3. Maybe he does that, so I end up having to leave space or whatever. But yeah, you're right. It's all about resources, but it's like there is a
There's
balance
balancing it,
there.
right? Yeah, exactly. Because at some point, like in that scenario, someone comes down with a lightsaber and clears you out.
Mm-hmm.
That's a better use of that 1 or 2 units, depending if it's an EP or not, versus just having it to lose or to utilize.
Right. And then the other side of it is I've been the thing where I have a stack of guys at one site, they have a stack of guys at one site, and I'm in space, so I'm not paying for battle order, but they're doing more damage per turn or something like that. And then they just keep putting more guys at their one site, and I'm like, okay, they're doing nothing,
Yeah, and that was the scenario. Yeah.
So that's probably closer to the scenario you were describing. So it's just
that
a matter
was a scenario
of playing reactively, as you were saying.
Exactly. Yeah, you're just piling up. Like, you have that system under control. You don't need another Star Destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need another, Fett and Slave One, or depending on whatever the format is.
Yeah. I think back in World. I think it was Worlds 2020. I was doing commentary on Chris Goglin versus Robbie Hendon, and I don't remember what Chris was playing, but I'm sure that Robbie Hendon was playing What We Have a Plan, because that's what he plays. And they were at the Naboo throne room, and both of them just had a stack of guys, and they both were good enough players to realize it's not even worth battling at this location.
So they just sit there and just stare each other down.
Stare at each other. I mean, I think there was stuff going on elsewhere, but they were both smart enough to neither deploy more cards nor battle. I think they like each initiated 1 battle, and like there's 5. They each have 5 guys there, and they like each lose 1 guy, and then keep going, and they realize that their resources are better spent elsewhere. where a lesser player would have just gone all in and just every single turn initiated battle. And maybe that would have been correct too. Also, if you're edging him out, if you're making him lose 1.5 characters every battle, and you're only losing one, or it's all.
But then does your opponent end up with more board presence in other places? It's more meaningful.
Right,
Meanwhile, you're wasting all your resources on that
right
location. So,
yeah,
that's what makes the game fun.
Yep. So let's move into the old Pivo questionnaire based on James Lipton's Inside the Actors Studio. So these questions are adapted from James Lipton's Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. So interpret them however you want. Some of them don't make a lot of sense. Just know that many of the questions mirror each other. So if I say, what's the thing you like? Don't say anything except for the thing I don't like. So first question, what is your favorite card?
Jeez. Right now, Coruscant Imperial Square. The reason why I like it, obviously it sees play in Ages of the Black Sun in the modern format, but I built a deck for Death Star 2, Reflections, kind of that era, that just starts that card, and it basically plays like an Ages of the Black Sun or a Hunt Down without actually using those platforms. So it plays fewer cards. It runs 6 Emperors. You drop Emperor, move them over to the Coruscant docking bay because you start Rest Order, pop it over to both the mobile docking bays, Presence of the Forces, boom, it's a whole deck archetype. I saw somebody else play it probably like a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, and it just shocked me. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. But yeah, I've been tinkering with that a little bit lately. So that's my favorite card right now.
What is your least favorite card?
As a retro player, there are many. And now I'm thinking about open stuff. Least favorite card right now. I would say Scanning Crew, but I feel like I've found a way to mitigate that. I'd say probably Deathmark right now, just because it's super frustrating as a light side player to actually get damage going and then have it canceled effectively.
What types of cards stimulate your creativity?
I would say all of the kind of cheesy cards, just because it allows you, at least in retro, and to a lesser degree, like we were talking about in open, it allows you to find different paths to victory. So when you layer that on top of an existing deck archetype, whether it's something brand new, whatever it may be, it just allows you to build a deck that's potentially very different and unexpected, but still effective.
Okay. What types of cards just make you want to quit the game?
Probably about every open card I hadn't seen before. I don't know if there's anything that really makes me want to quit the game. I would say cards that don't have an effective counter. Like, I think the key piece that makes this game fun, or the key element, is that everything has a counter. It may not be something that you necessarily have in your deck. It may not be something that's a complete 100% counter, like going back to the anger, fear, aggression versus like resistance, argument. If you don't have projective telepathy in your deck, I'd say it's just something that's completely unchecked and doesn't have an available counter.
Okay. What is your favorite Star Wars term?
It's not really a Star Wars term, but I'd say meta. Like, I think that's an interesting, and I realize it applies to other games, but I think that word is very pivotal. I can't speak, in describing the game as a whole. So I go with meta, even though it's not specifically Star Wars.
No. When you sit down against an opponent, what kind of deck do you like to see them pull out?
Depends what I'm playing, to be honest. I like to see from a pure enjoyment of the game, I want to see something that's different and surprising. from a ability to win, which I'll be honest, 95% of my objective when I play is to win. There's probably 5% that wants to have fun and enjoy it, even though winning is enjoyable in itself. It's something that I have an idea of, or at least a strong idea of what they're going to be playing and exactly how they're going to be playing it.
Okay. And what sort of opponent's deck do you dislike seeing?
The reverse of that. And I know you warned me. Yeah, I would say in a competitive format, just having no idea what they're doing. Like the first time I played against that Imperial Square deck, my first reaction was, what the hell? Why? This just doesn't compute. And I'd say in a casual format, something that's just abusive and boring, like talking about the Premier Hoth format, someone that runs a 10 or 15 scanning crew deck where it's not interactive, it's boring to play against. You know what's going to happen. It's just you're effectively wasting your hour in what should be a fun game.
I'd imagine the thing about that Imperial Square deck is, especially if you play it on like a random casual open table or casual whatever format table. And you don't recognize your opponent's name, like you're like, and it's like, does he not know that objectives exist? Like,
it's a fair reaction. Yeah, there's really no reason to play that card. And going back to some of the top retro players, it's actually one of the few wins that I've had against Paul Todd Feldman, is with that Imperial Square deck. So that's probably why I like it so much as well. I validated my interest in that as a deck.
I just you always, and then especially it feels particularly bad when they then proceed to kick your butt. With something like that. Now in open, it's a little less common to have something like that happen because as long as they start a starting effect and a starting interrupt, and that starting interrupt is not like Twilight Advisor or the Signal, then at least that they've got like, there's enough pieces that they have to know that that you're playing against a real person. If there's a problem, it's when they don't start a starting effect and it's like, oh, this is gonna be one of those games, huh?
Here we go. Yep. That's how it's gonna be.
All right. What Star Wars job would you like to try
in the Star Wars universe? There are a lot of it's very interesting to me. So one of my favorite trips I've been fortunate enough to go on was to Tokyo. I was in Japan for literally 3 days on a layover to Guam. And I noticed in Japan, there are a lot of jobs there where they stand there for a large percentage of the time just to perform a very simple task. There's a lot of that going on in Star Wars as well. I would say probably bartender. I feel like Werther in the Cantina probably has the most exciting and interactive job. There's always something happening. He's trying to tell droids to take a hike. I'd go with bartender in a questionable planet in the Outer Rim somewhere.
What sort of job would you want to avoid?
Oof. I feel like being the guy that pushes the lever on the super laser. He probably doesn't get a lot of action, and then when he does, it's a little rough mentally to know what you're doing with that push of the lever. So got to go with Death Star Gunner, and then you end up dead both times.
Yeah. And finally, what would you like to see happen with the future of the game?
That's an excellent question. So I really enjoy the open, I do enjoy the open format, but I was going to speak about retro. I really enjoy the retro format. I want to see it continue to grow. I want to see open continue to grow, continue to have new sets, continue to attract new players. The thing that I've started to notice with the game as I've kind of tried to jump into the open side is there's really this sidedness that seems to occur, and people label themselves as, oh, I'm a retro player. I don't do open because I don't like expanded universe. It's too complex. I don't like this. I don't like that. And then there's this resistance for some folks, but not everybody, because there have been actually quite a few open players jumping into retro. There's been this resistance towards participating in retro events, labeling the game as cheesy, non-interactive, all those things. I think at its fundamental core, the game is the same, right? It's just the tools and the cadence that's different. And I think both are very enjoyable. I think I'll grow to really like the open game. It's just a tough pill to swallow to just get destroyed pretty thoroughly most times you attempt to play. But look, it's like with anything. I just need more practice. So I'd like to see less of that splintering that exists moving forward. The other piece too is there's a bit of a movement in the retro side to ban a lot of cards in these formats, and that's going to cause a further splintering because you're designing basically a third version of the game. So now you're going to have open, you're going to have retro, kind of deciphered traditional, and then you would have this other modified format. There's some guys on the Discord book club that a lot of the retro players hang out on, and it's called Achievements, and it's basically a modified version of the game. Clayton, please don't kill me if I describe this incorrectly because I've never actually played, but there's a checklist of items to do throughout the game, and that's how you actually win the game versus depleting your opponent's life force. So I like to see these alternate formats discussed. Like Jawa, I think, is a really cool format over on the open side. And again, I describe it as a side, but it shouldn't be described that way, in my opinion. So I think it's cool to see these alternate formats, but I think for the health and the future of the game, it's in its best interest as an entity for there to be as few popular formats as possible, because the main reason that I played in openly here was just to have that larger pool of players to interact with in a large event. So, I think just to recap, it's just a more kind of a mingling of the two groups and kind of pulling down some of those invisible walls that really have no reason to be
So
there.
we can all focus on
Yes.
bullying the cube players.
Correct. Yes. or the players that don't allow reverts. One of the two. We've got a common enemy here. Yeah, but it really is a great game. And go ahead. Sorry.
Hold on a second.
You've got the hat. Oh man, there you go. Definitely
great to have a visual gag on the audio podcast.
On audio, exactly. No, and the other piece of it too is if you have both groups or both cohorts, whatever you want to describe it as, actively playing, it's for the betterment of the game. It's more money that the PC can raise, both formats and descendant kind of vestigial formats from those. They exist on GEMP. We all need GEMP to play, right? So it's for the better of the game for people to try it. And I would genuinely encourage retro players that haven't tried open, just go play, go watch a couple games, go get destroyed. It's fun. There's bits of the game that you'll see, oh, I really like this part of the game. Like QMC. QMC has never, ever been a tier 1 deck in retro, but to see it as a tier 1 deck for a period, I'm not sure if it still is right now, was really neat to see that and really enjoyable. And same thing with open players. There are a lot of people that have joined after Decipher had lost the license, and some within the last several years. Go try it. It's fun. It's still the same game that you like. It's just it plays differently, and it's fun.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming on, Geoff. And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, good luck, have fun, and no reverts.
Love it. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is a production of the KendallCast Podcast Network. You can support the show for just $2 a month at patreon.com/KendallCast or make a direct donation through the PayPal link at kendallcast.ninja. Every little bit helps.